The Nexus orbital station represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization's achievement in diplomatic architecture, a gleaming testament to what could be accomplished when 47 different species decided to stop shooting at each other long enough to build something impressive. Suspended in the gravitational sweet spot between three star systems, it served as neutral ground for commerce, diplomacy, and the occasional interspecies incident that required very expensive cleanup crews. The station's designers, in their infinite wisdom and crushing bureaucratic thoroughness, had implemented what they cheerfully called the Universal Protection Protocols. These guidelines, roughly 3,000 pages of mind-numbing legalese in standard Galactic, essentially boiled down to, don't let the fragile species get hurt, or we'll revoke your docking privileges and make you fill out forms in triplicate. Humans, naturally, topped the fragile species list. This classification wasn't entirely unfair, mind you. Humans possessed all the physical resilience of overripe fruit and the self-preservation instincts of particularly optimistic lemmings. They couldn't survive in vacuum for more than a few minutes, required a laughably narrow range of atmospheric conditions, and had the audacity to die if you poked them too hard with a sharp stick. By galactic standards, they were basically mobile houseplants with anxiety disorders and an inexplicable fondness for caffeinated beverages. The Korthax delegation had been particularly vocal about human fragility during the last galactic species review. Standing nearly 3 meters tall on 4 muscular legs, with carapaces that could deflect plasma bolts and mandibles capable of shearing through titanium steel alloys, they found the entire concept of human durability absolutely hilarious. Their representative had spent 20 minutes of valuable council time demonstrating how a human skull would theoretically crack under the pressure of what they considered a gentle handshake. Which made the current situation on level Gamma 7 particularly ironic. The young human female, barely out of adolescence by human standards, which made her approximately equivalent to a newborn by most species measurements, sat alone in the station's recreational district. She appeared to be doing something humans called studying, which involved staring at a portable information device while consuming alarming quantities of a brown liquid that registered as mildly toxic to most carbon-based life forms. Her name was irrelevant to this story. What mattered was that she represented everything the Galactic Protection Protocols were designed to safeguard: young, alone, apparently defenseless, and blissfully unaware that she was about to become the center of what would later be filed under Incident Report 471B, massive revision of species classification required. The girl wore typical human civilian clothing, fabric coverings that provided no meaningful protection against anything more dangerous than mild temperature fluctuation. Her footwear appeared designed more for aesthetic appeal than combat effectiveness. She had arranged her dark hair in what humans optimistically called a ponytail, though it bore no resemblance to any tail found in nature and would have been utterly useless for swatting flies or expressing emotional states. From an evolutionary perspective, she was a walking contradiction, a predator species that had somehow convinced itself and everyone else that it was prey. The recreational district buzzed with the usual interstellar melting pot of activity. Zephyrian merchants hawked crystalline art pieces that shifted color with the observer's mood. A pod of cetacean traders conducted business in their specialized aquatic chambers, their clicking vocalizations translating into surprisingly crude negotiations over shipping routes. The ever-present maintenance drones hummed efficiently overhead, their sensors constantly monitoring for any signs of interspecies friction that might require intervention. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary day in paradise, which was precisely when the Korthax hunting party decided to make their entrance. There were 5 of them, a number that would later prove to be 4 too many, though at the time it seemed like sensible overkill for dealing with a single human. They moved with the calculated swagger of apex predators who had never encountered anything capable of fighting back effectively. Their leader, a particularly scarred specimen whose carapace bore the ritual markings of a veteran warrior, surveyed the recreational area with the air of someone selecting items from a particularly well-stocked buffet. The Korthax had a cultural concept they called the claiming, a ritualistic hunt designed to prove one's worthiness for advancement within their rigid military hierarchy. Traditionally, this involved stalking and defeating a worthy opponent in single combat. However, given the unfortunate reality of galactic peace treaties and those tedious protection protocols, actual combat had become somewhat problematic from a legal standpoint. So they had adapted. Modern claiming involved psychological dominance, public humiliation, and just enough physical intimidation to make their point without triggering the station's automated defense systems. It was hunting with training wheels, but it served their purposes well enough. The human girl made for perfect prey by their standards. Alone, distracted, physically inferior, and protected by regulations that would prevent her from experiencing anything worse than emotional trauma and minor property damage. It was like being handed a participation trophy for breathing. The hunting party spread out with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated through subtle pheromone signals that most species couldn't even detect. They approached from multiple angles, cutting off potential escape routes while maintaining the pretense of casual movement through the area. To any outside observer, they appeared to be 5 individuals who just happened to be converging on the same general location. The girl remained focused on her studies, occasionally sipping from her toxic beverage and making notations on her device. She seemed completely oblivious to the approaching threat, which fit perfectly with the Korthax understanding of human situational awareness. According to their intelligence briefings, humans were notorious for their inability to perceive danger until it was literally breathing down their necks, and sometimes not even then. The leader positioned himself directly in front of her table, while his companions formed a loose semicircle, blocking her potential escape routes. It was textbook predator behavior, executed with a kind of precision that had made the Korthax the dominant species in their home system for the past 3 millennia. "Excuse me, little human," the leader said, his voice carrying the undertones of barely restrained aggression that made most species' fight-or-flight responses kick into overdrive. "You appear to be occupying our table." The girl looked up from her studies, her expression showing what appeared to be mild confusion rather than the terror they had expected. Her eyes, an unremarkable brown color that reminded the Korthax leader of dried mud, met his gaze without flinching. This was either impressive courage or spectacular stupidity. Given what they knew about humans, it was probably the latter. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar human quality that somehow managed to be both apologetic and completely unapologetic at the same time. "I didn't realize tables had assigned ownership here. Is there some kind of reservation system I should know about?" The question was delivered with such apparent sincerity that it took the hunting party a moment to process the subtle insult embedded within it. The leader's mandibles clicked irritably, a sound roughly equivalent to a human grinding their teeth, but considerably more intimidating due to the razor-sharp appendages involved. "Perhaps you misunderstand your situation, fragile one," he continued, deliberately using the term that most humans found offensive. "This sector operates under Korthax influence. Weaker species are expected to show appropriate deference." The girl tilted her head slightly, a gesture that among humans typically indicated curiosity or confusion, but which the Korthax interpreted as a challenge display. Around the recreational area, other patrons began to take notice of the developing confrontation. Several smaller species quickly gathered their belongings and relocated to safer viewing distances. A group of Zephyrian merchants suspended their negotiations to observe what promised to be an educational demonstration of proper Interstellar's hierarchy. "Korthax influence," the girl repeated, as if testing the words for accuracy. "That's interesting. Does that influence extend to overriding station regulations? Because I'm pretty sure intimidation of protected species is explicitly prohibited under the Nexus Accords." The audacity of a human, a member of the most protected species in known space, quoting regulations to a Korthax warrior was so unprecedented that the leader actually paused to process what he had heard. It was rather like having a houseplant lecture you about gardening techniques, theoretically possible, but so far outside normal experience that it required a fundamental reassessment of reality. "Regulations," he said finally, "are for species that possess the strength to enforce them." "Ah," the girl nodded sagely, as if this explained everything. "So you're saying that might makes right, and since you're bigger and scarier than me, the rules don't apply to your behavior." "Precisely. That's a fascinating philosophical position. Have you considered the logical implications of that worldview?" The Korthax leader exchanged glances with his companions. This conversation had already deviated significantly from their standard claiming script, which typically involved significantly more cowering and considerably fewer philosophical inquiries. Humans, according to their cultural briefings, were supposed to respond to intimidation with either submission or ineffective aggressive posturing. They weren't supposed to engage in Socratic dialogue. The only implication that matters, he said, falling back on more familiar ground, is that you will move from this location, now. The girl considered this for a moment, then calmly closed her information device and placed it in the small carrying case beside her chair. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and for a moment the Korthax leader felt a flash of satisfaction. Finally, some appropriate recognition of superior force. Then she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It wasn't a frightened smile. It wasn't even a particularly human smile, when you got right down to it. It was a kind of smile that made evolutionary alarm bells start ringing in the primitive parts of the brain, the parts that remembered when everything with teeth wanted to eat you. You know what the really interesting thing about might making right is? She asked conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than engaging in ritualized intimidation. It's that it works both ways. The transformation happened so quickly that later security footage would require frame-by-frame analysis to capture all the details. One moment, she was a fragile human girl standing beside a table in the recreational district. The next moment, she was something else entirely. The first Korthax warrior never saw the strike coming. The girl's legs swept up in an arc that physics suggested should have been impossible for a human joint configuration, connecting with the side of his head with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting a watermelon. The warrior's massive frame lifted off the deck plating and crashed into a nearby merchant stall, sending crystalline art pieces cascading across the floor in a symphony of expansive destruction. The second warrior had perhaps half a second to process what had happened to his companion before the girl's elbow found the soft spot where his carapace segments joined at the neck. The impact drove him to his knees with a choking sound that suggested his respiratory system had suddenly developed some serious design flaws. The third warrior, demonstrating the quick thinking that had made the Korthax a dominant species, lunged forward with his primary combat appendages extended, aiming for what should have been a disabling strike to the human center mass. Instead, he found himself grasping empty air as the girl twisted aside with fluid grace, her hand lashing out to deliver a precise strike to his primary visual sensor cluster. The warrior stumbled backward, temporarily blinded and bellowing in pain and confusion. The fourth warrior had managed to draw his ceremonial combat blade, a wickedly curved piece of molecular forged metal that could slice through most known materials like butter. He brought it down in a strike that should have cleaved the human from shoulder to hip, only to discover that the girl was no longer where she had been a microsecond earlier. The blade sparked harmlessly off the deck plating as its wielder overextended himself, leaving him perfectly positioned for the girl's counterattack. Her fist connected with the warrior's thorax with surgical precision, targeting what human medical databases would have identified as the Korthax equivalent of a solar plexus. The warrior doubled over, his combat blade clattering across the deck as his respiratory system forgot how to function properly. The leader, displaying the tactical acumen that had earned him his position, chose this moment to re-evaluate his strategic options. Unfortunately for him, the girl had already moved to limit his available choices. She flowed around his desperate swing with liquid grace, her hands finding nerve clusters that Korthax anatomy textbooks insisted should have been impossible for other species to locate accurately. The leader's legs gave out beneath him as his nervous system experienced what could charitably be described as a catastrophic software crash. He toppled forward, his considerable mass driving him face-first into the deck plating with a sound like a dropped piano. The entire encounter had lasted approximately 4 seconds. The girl stood in the center of what had recently been 5 extremely confident Korthax warriors, and was now a collection of groaning, twitching forms scattered across the recreational area. She brushed an invisible speck of lint from her civilian clothing and calmly retrieved her information device from its carrying case. "The thing about might making right," she said to the semi-conscious form of the hunting party leader, "is that you really need to be sure you have the most might in the room before you start making declarations about rights." Around the recreational area, several dozen witnesses from various species sat in stunned silence. The Zephyrian merchants had stopped their color shifting entirely, displaying a uniform shade of pale blue that indicated severe psychological shock. A pod of cetacean traders had actually breached the surface of their aquatic chambers to get a better view of the aftermath, their clicking vocalizations registering what human linguists would have translated as what the actual hell just happened. The station's maintenance drones, their conflict detection algorithms completely overwhelmed by the rapid sequence of events, buzzed in confused circles overhead like mechanical flies trying to figure out why their world had suddenly stopped making sense. Security Chief Valix, a veteran Centurion who had seen everything the galaxy had to offer in terms of violence, mayhem, and general chaos, arrived on the scene approximately 30 seconds too late to witness the actual combat, but just in time to observe its aftermath. He surveyed the scattered Korthax warriors with the expression of someone who had just discovered that all his fundamental assumptions about reality were incorrect. "Miss," he said carefully, addressing the human girl who was now calmly sitting back down at her table and reopening her information device, "I'm going to need you to explain what happened here." The girl looked up from her studies with an expression of polite attention. 5 individuals attempted to claim territorial rights over public space through intimidation. When peaceful resolution proved impossible, they escalated to physical confrontation. I defended myself using appropriate force. "Appropriate force," Valix repeated, looking at the groaning forms scattered around the area. "Against 5 Korthax warriors. I used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat," she replied matter-of-factly. "No more, no less. You'll notice they are all still breathing." This was, technically speaking, accurate. The Korthax warriors were indeed still breathing, though several of them appeared to be doing so with considerable difficulty, and none of them showed any inclination to resume vertical positioning. "Miss," Valix said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was beginning to suspect that his day was about to become significantly more complicated, "what exactly is your occupational background?" "I'm a xenobiology student," she replied, returning her attention to her device. "3rd year, with a focus on interspecies anatomy and comparative physiology. I'm actually writing my thesis on the identification and exploitation of common vulnerabilities across carbon-based life forms." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the groaning of injured Korthax and the confused buzzing of overloaded maintenance drones. "A student," Valix said eventually. "That's right. Though I do have some practical experience from my part-time job." "Which is?" "Combat instructor at the Terran Defense Academy's hand-to-hand training facility." Valix closed his eyes and took a deep breath, a gesture that looked remarkably similar across multiple species and generally indicated that someone was questioning their life choices. "You're a combat instructor." "Just part-time," she said helpfully, "and only for the basic courses. The advanced stuff is handled by the full-time faculty." "The basic courses." "Introduction to Asymmetric Warfare, Principles of Close Quarters Combat, and Survey of Alien Anatomical Weak Points," she recited. Nothing too exciting. In the growing crowd of onlookers, a Zephyrian merchant began making rapid calculations on a portable device. Within moments, he was transmitting updated risk assessments to his homeworld, adjusting the insurance premiums for any future business dealings with human-inhabited systems. The market price for human-grade protective equipment began climbing steadily across 3 sectors. The maintenance drones finally managed to process what had happened and began broadcasting automated incident reports to the appropriate bureaucratic departments. Somewhere in the station's administrative core, an overworked civil servant was about to have a very bad day explaining to his superiors why the universal protection protocols might need some rather substantial revision. Security Chief Valix activated his communication device and began the tedious process of filing an incident report that nobody was going to believe until they reviewed the security footage. He had dealt with barroom brawls, diplomatic incidents, and the occasional outbreak of space piracy, but this was his first experience with protected species demonstrates conclusively that protection may be unnecessary. "Attention Medical Bay," he said into his communicator, "we need a trauma team in the recreational district. 5 Korthax warriors with various injuries resulting from." He paused, looking at the girl who was now calmly highlighting passages in what appeared to be an academic text on evolutionary biology, educational correction. The girl looked up at the mention of medical assistance. "Oh, they'll be fine," she said reassuringly. "I was very careful to avoid anything that might cause permanent damage." The leader might have a concussion, and number 3 will probably have some vision problems for a few days, but nothing that won't heal." "How considerate of you," Valek replied dryly. "Professional courtesy," she explained. "Plus, causing permanent injury to members of a registered species would have violated the Nexus Accords. I tried to stay current on interstellar law." The irony was not lost on Valek that a member of the most protected species in known space had just schooled him on legal compliance while simultaneously demonstrating that said protection might be somewhat redundant. As the medical team arrived and began the process of collecting the scattered Korthax warriors, word of the incident began spreading through the station's communication networks. The story grew with each telling, as stories tend to do, but in this case the embellishments were hardly necessary. The basic facts were sufficiently remarkable on their own. Within an hour, emergency sessions were being convened in government buildings across a dozen star systems. The Galactic Species Classification Board was hastily reviewing several thousand pages of documentation regarding human defensive capabilities. The Korthax High Command was engaged in heated discussions about the theoretical possibility that their intelligence reports might have contained some minor inaccuracies. And in the recreational district of Nexus Orbital Station, a human girl continued studying for her xenobiology exam, occasionally pausing to sip her mildly toxic beverage and make notes about the fascinating relationship between species classification and actual survival capability. The Universal Protection Protocols, those 3,000 pages of carefully crafted bureaucratic wisdom, were about to undergo what scholars would later term comprehensive re-evaluation. The galaxy's understanding of human fragility had just suffered what military strategists would politely call a significant tactical adjustment. As Security Chief Valek completed his paperwork and the medical team finished loading the last groaning Korthax onto emergency transport gurneys, the girl packed up her study materials and prepared to leave for her next class. She paused at the edge of the recreational area, looking back at the crystalline debris and scorch marks that marked the location of the encounter. "Thank you for your professional handling of this situation," she said to Valek. "I hope this won't cause too much administrative difficulty." Valek considered the reports he would need to file, the explanations he would need to provide, and the complete revision of security protocols that this incident would undoubtedly require. "Just try to avoid any more educational demonstrations," he replied. "I'll do my best," she said with that same pleasant smile that had preceded 4 seconds of systematic violence. "Though I should mention that there are about 40,000 other students in the Terran University system, and most of them have much more practical experience than I do." She walked away with the unhurried gait of someone heading to class, leaving behind a recreational area full of confused aliens, overwhelmed security personnel, and one of the most significant challenges to established galactic wisdom in recorded history. The Nexus Orbital Station hummed on through space, its diplomatic mission unchanged but its understanding of the universe fundamentally altered. In the administrative offices, clerks were already beginning the massive task of updating species classification databases. In medical facilities across known space, xenobiologists were hastily revising their textbooks on human anatomy and defensive capabilities. And somewhere in the galaxy's vast communication networks, a simple message was beginning to propagate through official channels. Revision to Universal Protection Protocols, Priority Alpha. Human species classification requires immediate reassessment. Recommend updating threat level from requires protection to provides protection. Advise extreme caution when engaging humans in any form of confrontational behavior. The message concluded with a note that would become legendary in diplomatic circles. Species demonstrates remarkable capacity for converting from prey to predator without warning. Classification system requires fundamental overhaul. Thus ended one of the shortest and most educational interstellar incidents in recorded history. 4 seconds that changed the galaxy's understanding of humanity and introduced an entire civilization to the concept that sometimes the most fragile-looking package contains the most explosive contents. The human girl made it to her next class on time, where she took detailed notes on the theoretical applications of force dynamics in multispecies conflict resolution. Her professor, unaware of the morning's events, complimented her on the particularly insightful questions she asked about the practical applications of anatomical knowledge in defensive scenarios. After all, there's nothing quite like hands-on experience to enhance one's academic understanding of a subject.